So let's take a deeper look at forms by creating more form inputs and seeing how they work. I'm going to start by doing an HR here, horizontal rule. I'm going to do a file and save, and if I do a refresh, you have that horizontal rule right there, just to give a distinction that I want to start something else. And then I'm going to go ahead and do another H1 right here, and I'm going to do radio buttons. So let's take a look at radio buttons and how they work. I'm going to do H1, and if I do a file, save, and I refresh, I have radio buttons. So what are radio buttons? Well, there are times when you want a user to give you an input and you want that user to pick one of several choices. So for instance, if you have a sex where you have two options, male and female, of course you want a user to choose either male or female, and that's two options, but you want only one. Now for such a case, radio buttons now come in handy, because in radio buttons you can only choose one of several options. So you can have 5 options and then you want a user to choose only one. For instance, what kind of car do you drive? You have a Bentley, you have a Rolls Royce, you have a Toyota, you have a Nissan, and then you want a user to pick only one option out of those 4 options. Now when you use a radio button, the user is limited to pick only one option. So how do you create radio buttons in HTML? Well, to create radio buttons, you start just like we have worked with earlier by declaring your form, because you are working with forms. Forms is how you get input from your user. And then I'm going to just close out the form. And once I close out the form, I'm going to go ahead to add flesh to my form. So this time around, I want to do an input. Of course, you are doing input, so I want to do an input, but the type of my input is a radio. It's a radio button. So I want to do radio. And then once I do radio and I save file, I do a save, you would see automatically that now I have a radio button. But then I want to give additional tag attributes to this input by defining the name, the ID of that button. I'm going to say the ID of the button is, let me say, okay, I want to have male. Okay, let me say male. So we are going to have a radio button of sex, male and female. So I have ID is male. Then I want to have a name for my radio button, and I'm going to do name is sex, and I want to have a value for my radio button, and I'm going to say the value is male, something like this. If I do a file and I do a save and I do a refresh right here, that should come into play. So I have that, but then let's add some additional information so that it can come alive. So this time around, I'm going to do a label. Remember, a label is how we add a description. So what I didn't do earlier was I didn't put in a label. So because of that, we don't really have any description right here. So I'm going to do a label. And then since I have an ID of male for this radio, I'm going to do for, just like before, and I'm going to grab that ID for this particular input. I'm going to say male, and I'm going to go ahead to close that, and I'm going to say male, and I'm going to close out my label. Remember, each time you have a tag wrapping around some form of content, then you should have a closing tag. But then when you have an input or a tag, for instance, this input tag not wrapping around any content, then usually in HTML there is really no closing tag. If I do a file and I do a save, then I now have a radio button that has a kind of description right here. And then I can now go ahead to add the second button, which is input. I'm going to do a type, and I'm going to still do a radio. This time around I'm going to do an ID of let me just do female, which is F, and the name of that button. Now, since we are doing a radio button and we are grouping several buttons together to form an option, the name of the button will now be the same thing. So the name that is used here, which is sex, is what is going to be repeated here also, sex. And then the value for this will now change to female, since I'm doing female. And then I close out that. Then I do a label for that second one, and I do for, and the ID I want to attach this label to is F. So I just do an F right there, and I do a female, and I close out this tag label. And I do a file, I save, and if I do a refresh, I now have two buttons, male and female. So if I do an option male, you see male is selected. If I go female, then male goes off and female is selected. If I want to do male again, I go to male, you see male comes on and female goes off. So basically in radio button, I have a list of options, but then I can only select only one item out of those options. Let's just add a little bit of, okay, I can break this at this point. And if I do a file and I do a save and I do a refresh, you have that. So if I do, I can only select one option. Let me do one more so that you can see how this works clearly. So this time around, I'm going to just do, let me just do form, and I close out my form, and I want to do an input, which is a radio, and this time around I want to have a list of cars. So I'm just going to copy out the code here so I don't have to type again. And my form, let me do an HR tag here, HR, let me do H1 and say list of cars, car type, something like this, and I do H1. So I have my form, and in here I have my input, and the type of my input is a radio. Type of my input is a radio, and the ID of this input, ID equals exam, and the name is car, and the value here is sun, and I close out my inputs right there, and then I have a label. So I have label for the ID here is Nissan, so I'm just going to attach this label to Nissan, which is equal to Nissan, and I do Nissan, and I close out my label. And then I repeat the same thing for another type of car input type. I have my type is a radio button, so I'm going to do radio. The ID here is Toyota, and the name is, since I'm going a group of radio buttons, of course the name is going to be repeated as cars, and the value is going to be Toyota. And I close that out, and I have the label for, I'm going to grab the label, which is the ID of Toyota. So I'm just going to grab that label and have to, oh, I'm going to grab the label as Toyota, not Nissan this time around. It's going to be a Toyota. And I'm going to just write Toyota so that I can have a description and I have the label. So let's just save and refresh and see what this gives. So I do save, I do a refresh, and there you have it. Select car type. You have Nissan, you have Toyota, and then we can now add more buttons. So I can have, instead of a Toyota here, I can have a Bentley, something like that, and then the value is Bentley. The ID for will now be Bentley, something like Bentley, and the name will be Bentley. So I have Bentley. If I do a file and I save and I do a refresh, now I have 3 car types and I can only select one. So that, there you have it. That is how radio buttons work. And I can now break this out by doing a break here, just to add a little bit of formatting depending on how you want it to look. Sometimes you want it to stay horizontal like this, but for this purpose, let me just break it out by adding a little bit of formatting. I do a file, I save, and when I do a refresh right here, I should have Nissan, Toyota, Bentley, and I can just pick any of these. So there you have it. You have radio buttons and you see how radio buttons work. Now let's take a look at check boxes. So I'm just going to do a horizontal rule right here, HR, and I'm going to do the H1 heading, and I'm going to do check boxes. Okay, H1. I'm going to do a file, a save, refresh, and there you have it. You have check boxes. Now the difference between a checkbox and a radio button is that in the case of radio buttons, you can only pick one option out of a list of options. But in the case of checkboxes, you can pick multiple options. Let's see how this works. So I'm going to do a form. I'm building out a form, of course, and I'm going to close out my form, and then this time around I'm going to do an input, and my input is going to be of type checkbox, just like that. So I'm going to do input, and then the type of my input now becomes a checkbox, and the ID of my checkbox, I'm going to give it a ID of Apple. So let's say I'm creating a list of the food items that I like. So I'm going to say the ID is Apple, and I'm going to say the name is Apple, and the value, I'm going to put the value also as Apple, like that. And since the input tag is not wrapping around any content, then I just close it out with the closing angle bracket. And then let me give this checkbox a label so that we can have a description. So I'm going to go label for the ID of this checkbox is Apple. So I'm going to grab that ID and do Apple. And I'm going to close that and have the label as Apple, and I'm going to close my label right there. So if I do a file and I save and I do a refresh, you would see I now have a checkbox Apple. So let me add 1 or 2 more checkboxes and go input type is checkbox. and then I add a label. For the ID here is orange, so I'm going to attach that label to orange, and I'm going to do orange and close out my label. So now I have two checkboxes, and if I do a file, I save, I do a refresh, I have two checkboxes here, and then I can decide to pick those options. So in the case of checkboxes, you can select multiple checkboxes at the same time. So if I have a list of 15 checkboxes right here, I can go ahead to select as many options as required. But for radio buttons, you can only pick one option. And then when you look at the form for the check boxes, you would notice something. Now for each of the check boxes here, the name of the checkbox changes. So you have the name of this checkbox being an apple, and then the name of this checkbox being an orange. But in the case of the radio button, the name is the same to create a grouping. Okay, so you have to pay attention to that. And then finally, for this tutorial, let's add a submit button to each of the forms we have created. So we have like 4 forms here. This is a form for the username and the password. This is a form for the sex. This is a form for the type of car you drive. This is a form for checkboxes. Let's add a submit button to each of these forms. And how do you do that? Let's go back to the first form. So in the first form, where we have the username and the name, right after the password, let's do a break here. Let's just put in an input type, and we input, then we do a type, and then we do submit, because what we want to do is we want to submit the form, and then we have a value, and we call that a submit. And I close that input. So if I do a file and I save and I do a refresh, right there you now have a submit button. So if I click on this, this would essentially submit this form. So I'm going to add that same submit to others. I'm going to do a submit here, and I'm going to also do a submit right here, and I'm going to do a submit right here. So if I do file and I save, I do refresh, now I have a submit button for all these forms. Of course, you can decide to break the submit button into a new line by doing that, and if I do a save, I refresh, you can now see that submit button is on a new line. So if I click to submit here, then this form gets submitted. In the next video, I'll show you how submit works and how you can send the information in your form to a target location on your site or on a different web page. And then as you advance in your career as a developer, you would know how to take those form submissions and add some processing to the form submissions, probably at your server side or your client side if you use something like JavaScript, or if you use PHP on your server side. You just take the forms that you have submitted and you process those forms the way you like. I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.